Good morning, everyone. My name is Nancy Yanovicek, and I have had the pleasure of sitting on the Symposium Planning Committee for the last several months. And I have to say, it was by Zoom for a long time, and then when we came together here at the Confluence to meet with the organizers here, the relationship just changed, and it was just so much fun to have got to meet these wonderful people in person, and then it really changed the tone of the meetings as well. So it's been really a pleasure to work with all of you and to get to know you, and I think I can also speak on behalf of George on that as well. So welcome to the final day of the symposium hosted by the Confluence Historic Site and Parkland in partnership with the University of Calgary. We are gathered here today in the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, and Amskapelebigani First Nations. Aeha Nakoti Wiskabate First Nations, I apologize deeply, sorry, comprising the Chiniki, Bear Spa, and Goodstoney First Nations, and the Dene people of the Tsuut'ina First Nation. This is also the homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and the Optimistawik Métis government, Nose Hill Métis District 5, and Elbow Métis District 6. In 1875, the Northwest Mounted Police arrived and played a central role in the colonization of this area. They established Fort Calgary not only as a trading post, but also as part of a system of imprisonment and control. Before I introduce the speakers, I also want to take a moment to express our solidarity with the ATA, the Alberta Teachers Association. I know that there are rallies all over Alberta to stand in solidarity with them as they are taking job action to improve the conditions for our students in the classes. It's my pleasure today to welcome our keynote speakers, Dr. Sarah Carter and Brenda McCafferty, to present today. Dr. Sarah Carter is a professor of history and the Henry Marshall Torrey Chair Emerita at the University of Alberta. Her scholarship focuses on gender and settler colonialism. In 2023, she was appointed to the Order of Canada, and in 2025, she became the inaugural recipient of the Canadian Historical Association's François Xavier Garneau Prize, and that's a prize to recognize a lifetime achievement and a career achievement role for major contributions to the Canadian historical field. She's the author of many, many books, and to give you a sense of how many books she has written and co-edited and worked on, when I went to her retirement celebration at the University of Saskatchewan last year for the Western Canadian History, or the Western Canadian Studies Conference. You know when they give you numbers for the tables? This was a banquet hall that was full. So when you had to find your table, instead you were looking for a picture of the cover of one of her books, and the banquet hall was full, right? So that's how many books that she has published or co-edited, along with articles and a lot of other important work. I also want to mention the one that you're probably most well aware of, or people in this room might know, is the spirit and meaning of Treaty 7, which was written with the Treaty 7 Tribal Council and Dorothy First Rider, and it was also written with her late husband, Walter Hildebrandt. And when I sent this call for papers to Sarah, Sarah said Walter would be so happy with this call for papers. Walter also did a lot of work with Parks Canada and was a historical interpreter for forts as well, and he always wanted a more critical interpretation of the forts, and he fought with that, and he wasn't successful in doing that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that Walter would be really pleased and would thank the Confluence for the work that they're doing here to move towards meaningful reconciliation. Our second speaker is Brenda McCafferty, and she has been, the other keynote speaker, along with Sarah, is Brenda McCafferty, and she has been an archivist in Calgary for 35 years, working in both public and private repositories, including the Glenbow Archives, the City of Calgary Archives, and most notably for the past 25 years as archivist for the Legal Archives Society of Alberta. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Carter and Brenda McCafferty.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Nancy, for that wonderful, kind, generous introduction. And thank you to the organizers of the Confluence. I've really enjoyed my 2 days here with all of the fantastic speakers that we've been hearing. So we have a pretty packed paper, so I'm going to get right to it. I've long been interested in and curious to know more about the case of Jess Williams, who in 1884 in Calgary was charged with murder, convicted, and hanged in a short space of time. An African-American man, Williams was convicted of the murder of carpenter, settler, and store clerk from Nova Scotia, James H. Adams, at McKelvey's, a Calgary store. Adams was found deceased on February 8th. Williams was arrested the same day. His trial was on February 20th. His sentence was February 27th, and he was executed by hanging on March 29. Williams was the first to be executed in Calgary and the second in the then Northwest Territories, the first being in 1879, Kakasikuchin, or Swift Runner, a Nayawac Cree man. And Zach Beer, organizer, thinks the gallows were just over here to my right. So I'm interested in the narratives that were spun about this case at the time and later, how the newspaper coverage was believed and accepted and not questioned, how in subsequent years and decades, the story of the arrest, trial, and hanging of Williams was used to demonstrate how swiftly and fairly British justice was administered in this distant regime, in this distant corner of the empire, believed to be on the brink of vast expansion and with vast profits to be made. Like this short notice that I have from the Regina Leader that says, it's a matter for congratulation that swift retribution has overtaken this cold-blooded murderer. Nothing is more important in a new country like this than that the laws should be promptly and firmly administered, and the speedy vindication of justice in this case will do much good. The story added to the narrative of the superiority of Canada with our Northwest Mounted Police over the lawlessness, disorder, and chaos of the U.S., where lynch mobs dealt with criminals. I knew that the first executions by hanging in the West were Indigenous men, and then Jess Williams. Was there a pattern here? When white settler men were cold-blooded murderers, such as William Jumbo Fisk, who undoubtedly murdered a young Indigenous sex worker named Rosalie, probably Newgrass, in Calgary in 1889, he was first found innocent, then at a second trial convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to only 14 years hard labor. As Cheryl Fogle has emphasized in her work, narratives that evolved around John Ware, black cowhand and rancher, who arrived in southern Alberta in 1882, emphasized how white settlers were accepting, open-hearted, and welcoming, these were the narratives, to one and all, that race was never an issue. Though by digging deeper, she found this not to be the case, questioning the myth of community embrace. And the Jess Williams case also confounds this narrative. But I dug a little deeper into Williams' case as I thought about what paper I might do for this conference. And then I began to think that, well, it seems cut and dried. Williams confessed, and there's not much more to say. Then I contacted Brenda, and the whole situation changed. So she's going to talk about that.
In 2021, Lougheed House forwarded to LASA the written court transcript and case file of the James Adams murder case from Library and Archives Canada, the National Archives in Ottawa. Lougheed House wondered whether LASA would be willing to transcribe the handwriting and provide a typed transcript. The file contains 60 pages, including the court transcript and sworn witness testimony, the statement of the accused, and procedural correspondence arranging for the execution of Jess Williams 8 weeks later. At the time, I told Lougheed House it would take me a very long time to decipher the handwriting, at least 40 hours in my estimation, and they did not pursue the matter further. The file got tucked away in a pile of work I would tackle someday when I had some spare time. Fast forward to June 2025, when I was contacted by Sarah Carter at the University of Alberta. Sarah wondered about the existence of said court records pertaining to the Jess Williams case, and I remembered a little while later that LASA indeed did have a copy of the transcript. I quickly became immersed. The transcript and statement of the accused were fascinating, and I felt like I was the first person in many decades to have laid eyes on the stark facts of the case. I came to realize that the events had been misreported in every newspaper and published account. All that was known about the case was what the media told the public back in 1884. That initial reporting was subsequently recycled in publications and autobiographies, many of which I have brought with me today and are laid out on the back table. Case closed, no need to question the official narrative.
So while Brenda's going to go deeply into the details, my contribution is going to be to analyze the role of the press, particularly the Calgary Herald, provide some broader context from some of the literature on capital punishment. But in my analysis of the Herald, I'm going to look at how he was condemned and how the Herald constructed racialized narratives that increasingly painted him as a violent and demonic devil and monster. I'm going to look at some of his confessions that I believe may have been scripted for him. He did not read or write. I'm going to provide brief context on the other early executions in the West, as I've mentioned, all Indigenous men. Introduce something about the history of legal rituals and the pageantry of executions, and provide some comparisons, as I've already done, to the trial, and particularly the vigorous defense mounted of William Jumbo Fisk in comparison.
What I discovered in reading witness testimony left the impression that things were amiss. Lawyer James Lougheed, who represented Jess Williams in his first, last, and only murder case of his career, did not launch a defense. He rested after the Crown presented their case. The jury did not deliberate, and the jury pool, by all appearance, was tainted with several members having ties to the Northwest Mounted Police, to witnesses, and was stacked with town and civic council members. More to be said about this later. Further, several witness testimonies overlapped and contradicted one another. The conclusion to be drawn is that perjury was likely committed by several witnesses sworn under oath. The statement of the accused. Despite this statement of the accused, Jess Williams maintained his innocence, pled not guilty at trial, and had an alibi. The supposed statement of the accused is troubling, as Jess Williams could not read or write. The statement has signs of being fabricated, altered, and backdated, drawn up after the fact. It is written on 2 different stationaries and signed with an X, connoting a confession of guilt by Williams. Its authenticity does not pass the smell test. There was no direct evidence per se. The evidence was circumstantial, claims made by prominent citizens of the day. A consensus was reached with no objectivity. By today's standards, it was a miscarriage of justice and a summary execution. Swift frontier justice. All this to say, we cannot positively claim Jess Williams was 100% innocent. He may have played a part. We can never know for sure what transpired on the evening of Friday, February 8th, 1884. What we can say is that 1884 Calgary did not yet have a functioning judicial system, and there are many signs something was amiss. It is important to remember the Supreme Court of the Northwest Territories did not come into existence until 1886. And until that date, they were undoubtedly making it up as they went along. To provide background, the facts of the case are succinctly summarized in the following official letter written by Sam Steele, Northwest Mounted Police Commander in Calgary, to the headquarters in Regina, which I will read to you now. Warning, the letter contains some offensive language. Steele wrote to the Northwest Mounted Police headquarters in Regina the following account on February the 12th. I have the honor to report that at about 8:30 p.m. of the 8th instant, I was informed that a man had committed suicide in town. I sent Inspectors Dowling and Dr. Kennedy to examine the body and find out if this was the case. Inspector Dowling returned and reported that a murder had been committed. I immediately detailed men to search the town and try and trace the murderer. While that was going on, I heard that a young man named Francis had been at the scene of the murder shortly before the crime was committed, and I was on the point of sending for him when he came up and reported to me that he had seen a Negro, now in custody, in conversation with the murdered man shortly before the time that the murder must have been committed. I at once sent Sergeant Major Lake with a party to the teepee on the north side of the Bow River where this man lived. They found the Negro about 30 yards from his teepee and arrested him. Sergeant Smart, Corporal McGinnis, and several citizens searched the teepee of the prisoner and several other teepees in the vicinity, but found nothing suspicious. The prisoner was brought to the guard room, and traces of blood were found upon his clothing and hands, which he explained as having been caused by carrying home beef, which he had bought at the butcher shop. Inquiries were made at said butcher shop, where it was found that he had purchased meat, but it was frozen so hard that no blood could possibly have escaped from it. In the morning, Sergeant Major Lake, Constable McBain, McCrae, and Hetherington went to the scene of the murder. In searching the premises, Constable Hetherington found a razor about 6 yards from the back door, the razor being coated with blood, and about 50 yards further away from the house, the case of the razor was found. Later in the morning, Sergeant Major Lake and Sergeant Dunn followed tracks from the back of the house where the murder was committed to the Negro's teepee. On the way, seeing a place where he had evidently tried to wash the blood off his hands in the snow. Afterwards, they fitted the Negro's overshoes into these tracks and found them to correspond exactly. During the afternoon, a man came up and reported to me that in moving a hay pressing machine near the butcher shop, he had found a number of bills and a glove with marks of blood upon them. I sent for some squaws and a half-breed who lived in the same teepee with the Negro, and they identified the glove as his. This Negro, whose name is Williams, has since made a confession of his guilt. Note, the confession was signed on February 15th, three days following this letter. Steele concluded, Inspector Dowling rendered valuable assistance in this case. Also, Sergeant Major Lake and the troop in general deserve great credit for the prompt manner in which they turned out. I have the honor to be, sir, your obedient servant, signed Sam Steele.
Important to the setting of 1883-4 is the settler colonial context. The newly arrived settlers were greatly outnumbered by First Nations and Métis. There were approximately 4,500 First Nations people in Treaty 7 in 1883. In 1883, the Tsuut'ina, then known to the settlers as the Sarcee Reserve, was established directly west of Calgary, and the population of the Tsuut'ina was 425. The reserve was established much to the consternation of the settlers, and there was constant pressure over many years to have them surrender land because settlers didn't want Indigenous neighbours, and the land was valuable for its grazing land and mineral deposits. They were not wanted in the new town. Settler pressure was continual to keep them on their reserves, and there were numerous letters in the Herald about this, for there to be clear boundaries and delineations between the desired white settlers and the undesirable others. Nevertheless, in defiance, and because there was little to live on the reserve, there was an Indigenous village of teepees and tents on the outskirts of Calgary, made up of Siksika, Tsuut'ina, Cree, and Métis. There could be up to 100 teepees and government officials. The Indian agents and police constantly raided the village and tried to send them home. Jess Williams, who I will introduce more fully shortly, lived in this village and in a teepee, according to the reports of his capture, with a Cree woman. Perhaps he was married to her according to Indigenous marriage law, and another woman, we think it was his sister, her sister who had a sick child. This living arrangement would have further marginalized and stigmatized Jess Williams. Town fathers of the day wanted Calgary to be seen as a fertile field for settlers, ranchers, investors, industries, and though many of them were involved in clandestine activities themselves, as we'll see, they wanted to project a pure and orderly image. A pass system was implemented in 1885 that assisted to segregate the town from the new Tsuut'ina Reserve.
The lay of the land. In February 1884, the population of Calgary numbered 450 settlers. Calgary, on the eve of incorporation, was at the time an unincorporated village. The granting of the civic charter did not occur until November 1884, 9 months later. Fortunes were being made in railway land speculation and mining. Official accounts of early Calgary from this time period are sparse. To try and flesh out more information, I consulted the 1884 meeting minutes of the Town Civic Committee and was surprised to learn that there was no discussion at their meeting the day after the murder, February 9th. This despite the fact by newspaper accounts that the murder gripped the town and dominated headlines. The absence of information in official records piqued my curiosity, as I know as an archivist that the gaps in the record often speak louder than words. Given it was the first murder and hanging to have happened in Calgary and the incitement of racial tensions, it is surprising there is no mention of the events of February 8th regarding the involvement of council members in the trial, panic in the village, crackdown on the sale of essence and whiskey, the concern about increase in theft, and want for more patrols on the street.
Back to this slide that was from the Winnipeg Sun that I think is just obviously a caricature of what Jess Williams would have looked like. It's notable that legal authorities, including his own lawyer, James Lougheed, paid no attention to who Jess Williams was, where he came from, and what he had been doing with his life before he wound up in jail. There was evidence, for example, that he had been a soldier, but no one ever looked into this in any detail at all. This was in marked contrast to the 1889 Calgary trial of William Fisk from Ontario, who had served with the Northwest Field Force in 1885 and had been wounded, and he was cast at his trial as a patriotic young man of good family and fair antecedents. The judge described Fisk as a harmless boy and good-dispositioned young man with previous good character. In addressing the jury, Fisk's lawyer, who was brought out from Ontario, said that the jury must not allow their minds to be biased by any criticisms that had appeared in the newspapers. And he made a strong and eloquent appeal to bear in mind Fisk's previous good character and excellent connections, and his sad, sorrowing mother. No such appeal was mounted by Lougheed for Williams. There was a brief mention in his alleged final confession, I've said that he was a soldier. Biographical information available on Williams was in the press reports, beginning with the Herald, but they said very little. In the February 13th report, he was cast as an evil wretch and brute, having a diabolical appearance because of a little twitch in his eye. We know there's reports to have been written by settler George Murdoch, soon to be the mayor of Calgary, a harness and saddle maker, and we're going to hear more about him in a minute. Williams was reported in this first Herald coverage to be 43, born in Texas, which would likely mean he had been born into slavery, but that was never mentioned. He had lived in Dakota Territory for about 2 years before coming north to Canada in mid-1882, where he had worked as a cook for the CPR. He left the CPR in late 1883 and came to Calgary and was a cook at the Virginia Chop House and the Far West Hotel, but he had been unemployed for 2 weeks before his arrest. There were various stories told about him in the press, but there was a fair bit of consensus on the matter of him working as a cook for the CPR. One article in particular in the Winnipeg Daily Sun provided quite a bit of rich detail about this. The reporter had actually gone to a community of African American or black people in the North End and interviewed them, and found that Williams was well known to this is a quotation, to the colored population of Winnipeg, having lived there for 2 or 3 years. They reported he had been employed actually as a head cook for the CPR, which would have been a position of considerable responsibility and knowledge and so on. And that he had worked in the construction camps as a cook under Chief Engineer W.L. Barclay, who seems to also have been interviewed by this reporter. Williams was described in this article as a very delicate fellow who seldom got into any rows. When the camp disbanded, he settled in Calgary, got a job as a cook, and sent to Barclay for his back wages, and Barclay sent him $77 back wages. Williams was described by his friends in Winnipeg as always dressed very stylishly. He was, however, described in this article as a very ignorant man who cannot read or write. The reporter, as I said, he visited this community, talked to about 100 men and women, colored men and women, as he wrote, and reported that one man thought there must be some mistake, as Jess was too quiet a fellow to cut a man's throat. The reporter concluded that Williams was thought by all his companions to be a very decent fellow. He was described, however, in this article as being about 25 years old, while in the Herald he was described as 43. Otherwise, many details seem to parallel what was known of his life, as reported in the Herald. The Calgary Herald, however, reported nothing that could or might have cast any positive light on Williams. Though the Herald journalist at one point in one of his articles by George Murdoch allegedly asked Williams about the Winnipeg connection, and the convicted man allegedly stated that he had never been to Winnipeg. So very conflicting reports.
The case involves several prominent Calgarians, a who's who of early pioneers. James Lougheed represented Jess Williams. The young 29-year-old Lougheed was one of a handful of lawyers residing in Alberta at the time, having arrived in Calgary ahead of the CPR rail in 1883. At the time of the murder, he was courting Isabella Hardisty, the niece of Hudson's Bay Company chief factor Richard Hardisty, and was not yet married. Richard Hardisty took over as manager of the Hudson's Bay Company Elbow Post in 1883. Curiously, one of the material witnesses, a man nicknamed Hudson, had been shaving at McKelvey's store the night of the murder and placed the razor, the murder weapon, and a looking glass on the counter. Might Hudson refer to Richard Hardisty or another Hudson's Bay Company store employee? Surprisingly, Hudson was not called to testify at the trial, and his identity has been lost to history. Henry Bleecker acted for the Crown, Queen Victoria at the time. Bleecker was the first practicing lawyer in Alberta and a member of Civic Council. He was known to be a heavy drinker and was often imprisoned to dry up. Colonel James McLeod had taken a step back from his Northwest Mounted Police duties at this time and settled in Calgary. He was a trained lawyer, and by virtue of this fact was the natural pick for becoming stipendiary magistrate of the Northwest Territories, the first judge of Calgary. McLeod presided over the court proceedings and sentencing of Jess Williams. Now, by all accounts, Colonel McLeod was a trusted man to all. At the time of the murder, he was in Medicine Hat and out of the fray. He arrived back in Calgary 4 days later when the investigation was wrapped up and the Northwest Mounted Police assured him they had their man. Northwest Mounted policemen involved in the investigation include Sam Steele, who was the Northwest Mounted Police commander in charge of the overall investigation, and other Northwest Mounted Police officers who figured prominently first on the scene to investigate were Thomas Dowling, Sergeant Major Lake, Sergeant Fred Dunn, and Northwest Mounted Police hospital physician Dr. George Kennedy. Also, Dr. George Kennedy provided the forensic medical expertise at trial. The Calgary Herald. The murder occurred beside the tent office of the Calgary Herald. Thomas Braden and Andrew Armour were its founders. George Fraser's store, McKelvey's store, and the Cochrane Ranch Butcher Shop were located along the west bank of the Elbow River in close proximity. The Herald founders, Braden and Armour, were integrally linked to Civic Council and utilized for their jobbing work.
This is the Calgary Herald February 13th coverage. This is the first issue after the crime was committed that Friday, and it was a weekly. On the front page of the February 13th issue, the Herald called for the death penalty, and it had the case all wrapped up, though the Herald did actually call for a fair and impartial trial. But here's a quotation from that issue. The murder was described as cold-hearted, deliberate, and brutal in the extreme. The wretch who perpetrated it evidently was not possessed of one solitary humane impulse. Much more brute than man was the being who shed the blood and mutilated the body of poor James Adams. It's difficult to see how a fair and impartial trial in that community could proceed when Williams had been declared guilty of what was described as this blood-curdling murder. As mentioned, in the defense of William Fisk, his lawyer advised the jury not to be biased by newspaper articles.
The Diary of George Murdoch. After learning the 1884 to 1886 diary of Calgary's first mayor, George Murdoch, was available at the Glenbow Archives, I went there to see if it might shed more light on the case, and what I discovered was illuminating. 1. Following the murder of James Adams, store owner John McKelvey moved in with George Murdoch. 2. The sensational Calgary Herald newspaper accounts of the murder were entirely written by Murdoch. 3. Murdoch headed a vigilante lynch mob who were seeking a necktie social, according to Sam Steele, in the immediate aftermath of the murder. And 4, in the weeks before and after the murder, Murdoch had met personally with several key players involved in the trial. Judge Jeremiah Travis, it should be noted that Calgary's first mayor, George Murdoch, was only briefly the mayor on account of it being uncovered that he was heading a whiskey ring, was accused of cheating in the 1885 election, and together with the entire town council thrown out of office by Judge Jeremiah Travis in 1885. This is a picture of the 1884 Civic Council. There are many Civic Council connections to the murder trial. The Crown Attorney, Henry Bleecker, is pictured as town solicitor. Council member Simon Hogg was the first on the scene to discover Adams deceased in company with Pat McNeil and Tom Spearman. Council member Dr. Andrew Henderson, who is not pictured, along with Dr. Kennedy, presented the forensic evidence at trial. Council members James Riley and Isaac Fries were both jurors at the trial. Council member Dr. Neville Lindsay, the namesake of Lindsay's Folly and Lindsay Park Athletic Centre, is mentioned on several occasions in the court transcript owing to his absence from Calgary on the night of the murder. On February 8, 1884, Dr. Lindsay happened to be in Winnipeg to appear as Worshipful Grand Master for the initiation of the emergent Calgary Bow River Masonic Lodge. The Secret Handshake Society also has connections to this trial. Mayor Murdoch was secretary of both the Masonic Lodge and the Calgary Literary Club, who met every Friday evening, the night of the murder, at Boynton Hall, seen here in the slide. Following the murder, Murdoch joined Dr. Lindsay in Winnipeg for the lodge initiation ceremony on March 1, 1884. Secret society members who were gathered at Boynton Hall on the night of the murder formed a lynch mob whose deed was narrowly averted by the swift action taken by Northwest Mounted Police Commander Sam Steele. The secret society members included the following men connected to the trial: Dr. Neville Lindsay, George Murdoch, self-described in his diary as Lion of the Boys, Captain James Stewart, a prominent landowner, personal acquaintance of Sir John A. Macdonald, who later went on to be the leader of the 1885 Northwest Rebellion. Isaac Fries, a fellow New Brunswicker, or Blue Noser as they referred to themselves, was a member of Civic Council and a member of the jury. Billy Mitchell supplied the horses for the citizen arrest party of Jess Williams. Malcolm Patterson McNeil, who was returning from a hunting trip, was the first to discover James Adams deceased. John McKelvey, the owner of McKelvey's store, moved in with George Murdoch following the murder. Northwest Mounted Police Sergeant Major Lake was a lead investigator who penned the confession, the statement of the accused. And lastly, James Riley, also a member of Civic Council and a jury member, hosted the inaugural meeting of the Bow River Masonic Lodge at his home on January 28th, a week prior, where discussion of the white argument was noted in Murdoch's diary. As an aside, settlers in this era felt threatened and frequently racialized those they deemed to be inferior. Conversations and debates pertaining to racial inclusivity are widespread in newspaper accounts of the day. These are the people who form the backdrop to the story. Other persons of interest. This slide features photographs of two figures prominently involved directly and peripherally that we were able to locate images of. The alibi of Jess Williams and the defense that was never launched. Testimony given by the Cochrane Ranch butcher Thomas Nealons stated that Jess Williams had been at the butcher shop twice that day, once at 6 p.m. and again between 8 and 9 p.m. during the time of the murder, therefore providing an alibi. Jess Williams firstly paid his account at 6 p.m. Further, he had a First Nations boy with him who was tasked with carrying the purchased meat home to the teepee lodge north of the Bow. The butcher testified that Williams returned again between 8 and 9 p.m., asking for a receipt requested by Thomas Dowling of the Northwest Mounted Police. What dealings did Detective Dowling have with Jess Williams, and why wasn't Dowling questioned about this? Forensic testimony provided by Dr. Kennedy and Dr. Henderson indicate that Adams was attacked from behind and unaware. There were no signs of a struggle. Dr. Kennedy said he must have been held tightly for his throat to be cut so deeply. Adams was young and very strong, so no struggle seems unusual. The razor blade made 2 slices through his windpipe to the spine. Death was instant. The head of the victim was afterwards bludgeoned with an axe while his body lay prone on the floor. The above testimony gives credence to the theory that more than one person may have been involved. A defense that was never launched by Lougheed might have included the following questions had Jess Williams taken the stand. If we are to believe the statement of the accused penned by Sergeant Major Lake, Jess Williams visited Gibbs' company store at 7 p.m. There is a 4-hour discrepancy in the timeline here according to witness testimony provided by Far West Hotel cook Richard Brown, who stated it was 3 p.m., not 7 p.m. Gibbs paid Williams money that was owed to him from Joe Chandler, the black porter at the Far West Hotel. Williams used some of the money to purchase 6 bottles of essence of lemon. He drank 2 bottles of essence in Gibbs' store and took 4 bottles to the Far West Hotel. He arrived at the Far West Hotel at approximately 7:15 p.m. and spoke to a former colleague and waiter named Frank, whom he shared 2 bottles of essence with. Jess Williams then returned to Gibbs' store to purchase more bottles of essence, but Gibb refused to sell him more, so he once again returned to the Far West Hotel. Neither the waiter Frank nor storekeeper Gibb testified at trial about all this going back and forth. Gibbs refused to sell Williams more essence after his second visit to the store 30 minutes before the murder took place. Jess Williams then apparently went out to the street and drank a pint of whiskey purchased from an unknown dealer. Gibbs was the last person to speak to Williams before being placed at the scene in McKelvey's store by the mysterious witness Edmund Francis, whose identity remains a mystery. Gibbs' testimony at trial would have been important in establishing his state of mind, how the scene looks today, and a couple of practicalities. The weather on February 8th and 9th, according to Murdoch's diary, was bitterly cold. Why would Jess Williams leave his bloody gloves hidden under the hay press, then scatter the money stolen from the cash register, $33, and walk home miles north without gloves? A 2-hour walk by Northwest Mounted Police accounts. Also, the murder weapon was discovered on the bank of the Elbow River along the trail. Why would the murderer dispose of the razor along the trail instead of just throwing it into the river directly beside? 6 defense witnesses were not called to testify. Hudson, linked to the murder weapon, Joe Chandler, storekeeper Gibb, Frank, the waiter at the Far West Hotel, Constable Dyer, who made the first official report to the Northwest Mounted Police Post, and the First Nations boy mentioned at trial proceedings. Joe Chandler, the black porter at the Far West Hotel, and Jess Williams were quarreling on the day of the murder, according to Richard Brown. Richard Brown provided the time of the quarrel as 3 p.m. Joe Chandler owed Williams money, $40, and had presumably paid him a lesser amount. Jess Williams used whatever money he did receive to pay off his accounts around town and purchase alcohol. Curiously, a few days before the execution on March 25th, George Murdoch mentions having dinner with Joe Chandler, and one wonders what they discussed. Later down the road, newspaper accounts tell us that Chandler moved to Montreal, where he himself was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison. A First Nations boy accompanied Williams to the butcher shop on the day of the murder, but was not called to testify at the trial. According to witness testimony provided by Thomas Nealons, the Cochrane Ranch butcher, the boy carried the meat home from the butcher shop back to the Sarcee camp north of the Bow River. Did the meat package leak blood along the way? Why didn't Williams accompany him for the trip back home? We can only assume he lingered in town, having a little money in his pocket to indulge in drink. Northwest Mounted Police Inspector Thomas Dowling, as previously mentioned, was not questioned about his involvement in the 8 to 9 p.m. revisit to the butcher shop made by Williams at his behest at the time of the murder. Nealons testified at trial that Williams, upon his return to the butcher shop between 8 and 9 p.m., said he was asked by Thomas Dowling to return and get an account receipt from the earlier purchase made at 6 p.m. A strange and somewhat chilling article appeared in the Calgary Herald on the day of sentencing, February the 27th. Given the circumstances of James Adams' murder, the article brought to mind George and Kate Fraser's testimony at trial. George Fraser admitted to going to McKelvey's store, returning home, and changing into his overshoes before going back again. The tracks of a person wearing overshoes were identified standing tippy-toe and peering into McKelvey's store window, and may solve the mystery of the overshoe tracks found in the snow. Might George Fraser have witnessed the murder of James Adams? If so, did he and his wife bear false witness at trial? George Fraser was undoubtedly agitated at trial. His wife also got up on the stand to provide the 8:30 p.m. timestamp for the murder and was therefore the last person to talk to and see James Adams alive. Might the Frasers have been pressured to make this testimony? A biographical entry about George Fraser is included in Calgary's 1885 directory, which I have brought with me today and is on the back table. It curiously mentions his wife, Kate, and something about the mention of his wife strikes me as unusual. It reads as follows: Mr. Fraser came to the Northwest to push his fortunes, and if ever a man was entitled to succeed, Mr. Fraser is certainly that individual. Like many other successful businessmen, Mr. Fraser has found an untiring advisor and assistant in Mrs. Fraser, to whose sound judgment Mr. Fraser is undoubtedly indebted for much of his success.
But this is, again, the Calgary Herald coverage. On the Saturday after Williams was found guilty at the Thursday trial, Williams was supposedly interviewed in his jail cell, obviously by Murdoch. And Williams was made to seem ever more evil and bloodthirsty, who had been prepared to kill many more white settlers if he had had the opportunity. Williams allegedly stated he expected to be found guilty. Murdoch allegedly asked questions that had perhaps been puzzling to the readers in the settler community. Why did he head home after the murder and not try to escape? And why did he return to the store after killing Adams? Williams replied that he planned to start the next morning. He was going to go to the Cypress Hills, where they would never have found me. He also allegedly stated, I hear the citizens talking of lynching me, and I just wish I had known of it. If I'd once thought of them coming for me that night, I could have killed every man as they came up. And he said he had an old double-barreled shotgun and lots of buckshot, and he would have loaded up and just killed everybody who came after him. The reporter asked him why he returned to the store, and the reply was that he needed to make sure that Adams was dead, and whether he had spoken to everyone. Williams also allegedly asked asked the reporter what the citizens would have done if they had found him, and the reply was that he would have been hanged on the spot. Williams then supposedly stated that he was going to ask the judge to give me 2 6-shooters and hold off the police and then turn me loose to the citizens of Calgary, as they wanted me so badly. I would have made short work of a few of them. So I just wonder if these were actually the words of a man who had never before allegedly been in a scrape. And he was unable to read or write what was said about him in the Herald. A final interview with Williams was reported in the March 19th Herald, and Adams was cast as ever more kind and understanding, and Williams all the more brutal. More details were added to his previous so-called confessions. Williams said Adams had caught him stealing, but had said he would forgive him this time, but he must not steal again. And Adams allegedly told him many times that he would forgive him, but Williams couldn't trust him, and then he killed him. Williams then was quoted as in the Herald in the words of what I believe to be more of an educated English gentleman. He was reported to have said, "My crime I know to be horrible, and could any atonement of mine undo the wrong I have done, I would willingly make it. I do not grumble at my sentence, but fully acknowledge its justice. I have been spending my time in prayer and supplication, and now do not fear death, but throw myself on the hallowed mercy of God through Christ." And he actually was not a Christian by the time when he received his sentence. Anyway, but he was apparently converted. On April 2nd, the Herald described the last hours of Jess Williams and hanging in detail. There was an emphasis on the charity shown Williams through the ample time he had been given to seek forgiveness for his crime. It was reported in his very last few days he expressed the deepest remorse while agreeing that the sentence was just. He had a hasty breakfast, climbed the scaffold, turned pale, but appeared perfectly calm. Being asked if he had anything to say, he allegedly addressed the following words to those present: "Gentlemen, this is the 3rd time I have faced death, but the former occasions were very different from the present. I've been a soldier and consequently have been exposed to death in various shapes. But I fear it less now than ever I did before, having been prepared to meet my God. I think I'm going to heaven and sincerely trust that the man I killed has reached there too. In conclusion, I thank the officers for their kind treatment of me during my confinement, the lawyer who defended me, and the people of Calgary. I am here through drink. I assure that I have dismissed all malice from my mind." The Herald report concluded, "Let this be a warning to all evildoers to amend their lives." The blot upon the history of Calgary has been wiped out by the execution of Jess Williams. Let it never again be sullied by a deed so foul. Then I just have a section about how these alleged confessions and alleged behavior of Williams conform to expectations of the contrite, convicted person who has accepted their fate, acknowledged the justice of the sentence, thanked his incarcerators for their kind treatment. This expected behavior goes back, of the condemned, reaches as far back as Anne Boleyn in 1596 and probably much farther. The condemned was supposed to admonish the spectators to learn from their sorry plight, confess their guilt, express faith in God's mercy. They were to appear calm and resolved, otherwise there might be sympathy for the condemned. An execution was a ritual or performance arranged as a morality play with justice, humility, and the threat of death displayed in order to warn and edify the spectators. Executions were to punish, deter, and embody justice. They also reinforced the value of the dominant normative system and the need for social order by destroying, humiliating, and ridiculing what it defined as evil. The convicted was to die bravely and not put up a display of weakness or frailty, as the punishment could then appear to be barbaric and repressive rather than just, righteous, and moral. If the conviction was supported by only weak or circumstantial evidence, there was a danger of public sympathy for the accused, and the Herald made sure that there was no such public sympathy. And the condemned was also to embrace Christianity, which he did. There was a Father Charles Claude, who allegedly baptized him, instructed him in prison, accompanied him to the execution, and reported that Jess died bravely as a Christian. So I was going to give a little bit more about the early hangings in the Prairie West, but I think I've said a lot about that already. It was there in Canada between 1867 and the end of capital punishment in 1976. There were 710 executions in Canada, and over 65 Indigenous men were executed. There's no such statistics for Black people. Capital punishment was a technique of settler colonial governance intended to intimidate, eliminate dissent, and resistance, a colonial tool. And then my last remarks were going to be about sort of the later narratives and how the Jess Williams case was used by Mounties in later narratives to demonstrate not only their determination to quickly solve cases and restore confidence in law and order, but to declare British justice was superior to the work of the lynch mobs in the West. So I was going to use a quote from Sam Steele, but I think I'm going to cut it short there and just say we have some lingering questions, and we had to really condense to bring it together in this talk, and I realize it's very detailed and dense at some points, but we hope to do a long article or a short book about this.
So true. So some concluding remarks and some lingering questions about some major inconsistencies. Jess Williams may not be entirely innocent, but he was not the architect. The crime scene was disturbed and contaminated. Back in the day, there was no ability to test blood, no photographs, and snow tracks of footprints melted. The testimony itself weaves in and out with lengthy, irrelevant asides, causing great confusion. It is impossible to follow the thread of the story. After all this, the jury did not deliberate and sentenced Williams to hang immediately. Jess Williams did not read or write and claimed he was innocent. We cannot rely on the statement of the accused. Similarly, the witnesses, Religious, the Fox, and Little Chief, spoke Cree and did not read, write, or speak English. The interpretation made at trial cannot be confirmed or relied upon. Additionally, Religious, Williams' common-law wife, provided testimony for the Crown. Today, this would not be permissible. The role the media played in the case was substantial and very detrimental to Williams. The media stirred up racial tension in the community. Their racial depictions of Williams demonized him in the eyes of the public. It was all contrived. By doing so, the media gained the consensus of the people. Jess Williams was found with money in his pocket at the time of his arrest, $9.75. The money in his possession was not the money stolen from the cash register, the $33, which was left strewn across the ground on the west bank of the Elbow River, a 2-hour walking distance from where he lived. The timeline presented by various witnesses do not match up. Williams could not simultaneously be at the butcher shop, Gibbs' store, the Far West Hotel, and at McKelvey's store as described by various witnesses who gave conflicting testimony. Gibbs' store was located very far away along Stephen Avenue, and the timeline is implausible given the walking distance. So, was the murder of James Adams pinned on Jess Williams, i.e., was he a patsy? Were the court proceedings a show trial? We let you decide.
I know.
Like, wow, thank you for that great keynote. What a fascinating story, and I vote for the short book. If you have questions, please put your hand up and the volunteer will bring a mic to you.
That was a great lecture. I missed the first few minutes of the presentation, so I'm wondering, did anybody investigating this particular crime come up with a concrete motive as to why Adams was murdered, even if it wasn't by Williams? Or like, were there other people in the community that had a grudge against Adams? Or
I think the motive was the money in the cash register. And with respect to the second part of your question, did anyone else hold a grudge against James Adams? Found no evidence of anybody saying anything badly about him. But it is a little bit more complicated than that. I had a lot of trouble finding any record whatsoever of even the existence of James Adams, funny enough. He apparently came out to Calgary with John McKelvey. They came across the prairies together. This was before the arrival of the train in Calgary, so it must have been quite a journey. They must have been quite chummy, quite close, you would think. Their families were friends. And funny enough, McKelvey spoke little about this relationship on the stand during the trial. And further, I was surprised in looking through the St. John, New Brunswick newspaper that there was no mention of their son, James Adams, having been killed. It was written up a lot in the Calgary Herald, of course, in the Winnipeg newspaper, and in the Regina Leader. But I thought that was curious that there was no mention of Adams whatsoever back in his hometown where his mom and dad were. So it does remain quite a mystery. Funny enough, John McKelvey died. He immediately returned to New Brunswick after this murder, his home in New Brunswick, and he died a really funny way in 1895, just a few years later. He was found decapitated beside the railroad tracks, apparently having been hit by a train. And in my search for information on John McKelvey, I discovered that there was a second John McKelvey who resided here in Alberta, in Lethbridge of all places. And when I was reading his obituary, it read almost like James Adams. They had been born in this place called Arran in Scotland, which is Arran Butte, Scotland, and I thought that was strange that there was this John McKelvey, seemingly of no relation, living in Lethbridge, who had the exact same area of Scotland that they were born and came from. So James Adams remains a bit of a mystery.
Brenda's research is remarkable. It's true. And what she can remember about all these details.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering if the defense, Mr. Lougheed, had any kind of archival records from his practice that you were able to chase down, or do they exist, or maybe they don't?
They don't exist. You know, Lougheed House is a historical site and a museum facility here in Calgary, and they do actually maintain archival records about the family, but with respect to his legal records per se, not a lot of information, except that it is notable he was a very, very prominent lawyer here in Alberta. He was the first lawyer entered onto the rolls of the Law Society of Alberta and served for many years as a bencher of the Law Society. And so at the Legal Archives where I work, we have a lot of information about the Law Society of Alberta and the part that he played as an early bencher. He was definitely the senior member of the bar with great respect, and he went on to have quite a legal practice in partnership with R.B. Bennett. It was called Lougheed and Bennett, and R.B. Bennett was later went on to be Prime Minister of Canada. He had brought R.B. Bennett, coincidentally, out from New Brunswick to be his law partner. They had quite a public split up their law firm in 1922. In the Legal Archives, we certainly have records regarding that event. But as far as his individual client files, there's not much.
Narratives about this trial at the time and later really stressed that how fair, how fairly Williams was dealt with, because he had this, top lawyer. And so I had assumed that was the case, and that's why I wasn't going to delve into this very, very much. And then it was Brenda who just said, yeah, he mounted absolutely no defense. It was
all
remarkable.
The published accounts said that he mounted a vigorous defense and did a great job. So I was expecting to see this, but that wasn't what the transcript of the court case.
We'll take one more question and then we'll go on.
Thank you. So, number one lesson, never believe what you read in a newspaper. But I was wondering how the people that ran the Herald, how long were they? Do you know how long they ran that Herald with that editorial built into their newspaper stories?
The Herald seems to have changed hands over and over again in the first few years of its existence. It was only in existence, I mean, directly across the rail tracks from where we are now, in that tent location that we showed in the slide. It was only there for the year of 1884. By 1885,